In a forgotten town shrouded in silence and fear, one man arrives with a past as unyielding as his resolve. Jack Turner, a retired Marine seeking peace, becomes the target of a ruthless gang that mistakes his calm demeanor for weakness. Behind the terror of the gang lies a powerful family ruling through corruption, but Jack's quiet strength becomes their greatest threat. Lines will be drawn, secrets uncovered, and a town pushed to the brink of collapse. In the fight for freedom, heroes will rise. But at what cost? Prepare for a gripping tale of courage and redemption that will leave you breathless. But before diving, let me know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because we'll be bringing you more amazing gift tomorrow. Now let's start this journey together. The afternoon sun burned brightly over the quiet town of Harmony Ridge, its rays casting long shadows over the weathered storefronts and dusty roads. Jack Turner stepped out of his old pickup truck, the door creaking loudly as he shut it behind him. A man of imposing size, Jack stood tall with broad shoulders and a solid, barrel-like chest that made it clear he wasn't someone to be trifled with. His faded Marine Corps cap sat snug on his head, shielding his dark eyes from the relentless glare. Jack had only been in Harmony Ridge for 2 days, but the town already felt like a far cry from the chaos he'd left behind. The noise, the pressure, the constant grind of city life. It was all in his rearview mirror now. Here, he hoped to find the quiet he so desperately needed, a chance to rebuild himself in the stillness of a slower pace. But as he stepped onto the sidewalk, his boots scuffing against the worn concrete, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The streets were lined with small businesses, a general store, a barber shop with a spinning red and blue pole, and a diner with a neon open sign, flickering faintly against the cracked stucco. A few locals stood outside the shops, their gazes lingering on Jack just a little too long. It wasn't outright hostility, but there was something in their eyes, a mix of curiosity and apprehension, that made Jack's jaw tighten. He wasn't a stranger to this kind of attention. His size alone was enough to draw stares. But here, in this quiet, predominantly white town, there was another layer to their looks. Jack had learned long ago not to let such things get under his skin, but it didn't mean he didn't notice. With a deep breath, Jack adjusted the brim of his cap and continued walking. His goal today was simple: check out the diner he'd passed when he first arrived. It looked like the kind of place where time had stood still, the kind of place that might offer a decent meal and a moment of peace. As he pushed open the diner's door, the bell above jingled, announcing his arrival. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and fried food, a combination that should have felt comforting but instead carried a hint of tension. Booths lined the walls, their red vinyl seats worn and cracked in places, and a long counter stretched across the room, dotted with chrome stools. A few heads turned as Jack stepped inside, and the conversations that had filled the space moments ago quieted to murmurs. Jack ignored the stares, making his way to a booth near the window. He slid in, the vinyl seat creaking under his weight, and placed his hands on the table, his fingers idly tracing the faded patterns on the surface. It was only then that Jack let out a small sigh, allowing himself to relax just a little. The waitress approached a moment later, her uniform slightly rumpled and her hair pulled back in a hurried bun. She was in her late 40s, with tired eyes that held a flicker of warmth, but also wariness. "Coffee?" she asked, pen poised over a notepad. "Please," Jack replied, his deep voice steady. "And whatever special you've got today." She nodded quickly and retreated behind the counter, her movements brisk and efficient. As he waited for his meal, Jack glanced around the diner, taking in the room's details. It was a relic of another time, with checkered tile floors and an old jukebox in the corner that looked like it hadn't played a tune in years. The few patrons inside kept their conversations low, their eyes occasionally darting in his direction before quickly looking away. Jack tightened his grip on the Marine Corps ring he wore on his finger, turning it absent-mindedly. The ring was a reminder of who he was, a man shaped by discipline, resilience, and sacrifice. It was also a reminder of why he was here. For 20 years, Jack had served his country, navigating some of the toughest terrains and most dangerous situations imaginable. He'd seen the worst humanity had to offer and had survived. But the scars, both visible and invisible, had stayed with him. The hustle of the city, the endless noise, it had all become too much. He needed a change, a fresh start. Harmony Ridge had seemed like the perfect place. It was small, quiet, and unassuming, the kind of town where people waved to their neighbors and where life moved at a slower, more manageable pace. It was the kind of place where he could focus on teaching, a job he'd always dreamed of doing once he left the service. The community center on the edge of town had been his first stop. When he arrived, a modest building with a small gym and a few multipurpose rooms, it had reminded him of the recreation centers he'd spent time in as a kid. Teaching fitness classes there felt like a way to give back, to share some of what he'd learned over the years about discipline and perseverance. Jack's thoughts were interrupted as the waitress returned with his coffee and plate of food. "Here you go," she said, setting the plate down gently. "Thanks," Jack replied, offering her a small smile. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to the Marine Corps logo on his cap. "You military?" "Used to be," Jack said simply. She nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Well, thank you for your service." Jack dipped his head in acknowledgement before turning his attention to the steaming plate of food in front of him. As he ate, Jack allowed himself to enjoy the quiet moment, though he couldn't entirely shake the unease he felt. He knew better than to expect instant acceptance in a place like this. Trust was something earned, and he was willing to give it time. Still, he couldn't help but wonder if Harmony Ridge would ever truly feel like home. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long golden streaks across the diner's floor, Jack finished his meal and stood to leave. He left a generous tip on the table, nodding politely to the waitress as he made his way to the door. Outside, the town was bathed in the warm glow of dusk. Jack took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs. He adjusted his cap and climbed back into his truck, the engine rumbling to life. This was only the beginning. For now, Jack Turner would focus on the little things, teaching at the community center, getting to know the people of Harmony Ridge, and finding his place in this quiet town. He'd faced bigger challenges before, and if this was the road to peace, he was ready to walk it one step at a time. What Jack didn't know was that his journey was about to take an unexpected turn. In this quiet arrival, it was just the calm before the storm. The diner was quieter than it had been during Jack Turner's first visit. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the lunch rush had subsided, leaving the place half empty. Jack appreciated the calm. He had made the diner a regular stop since arriving in Harmony Ridge, partly for the food, but mostly for the opportunity to watch and learn. Small towns like this had their own unspoken rules, and Jack knew that observing the locals was the first step toward understanding them. He sat in his usual booth near the window, sipping his coffee and flipping through an old newspaper he'd picked up on his way in. The clatter of plates and faint hum of conversation provided a soothing backdrop. From where he sat, Jack could see the whole room, an instinct he'd carried from his years in the Marines. The waitress, who had introduced herself as Marla during his second visit, approached with a cautious smile. "Need a refill?" she asked, her pen hovering over her notepad. "Sure, thanks," Jack replied, his tone even. As she poured the coffee, Jack glanced around the room. A pair of older men sat at the counter, discussing weather patterns and crop rotations. Near the jukebox, a young mother tried to wrangle her energetic toddler, who was more interested in the colorful buttons than the half-eaten sandwich on his plate. It was a peaceful scene, until the bell above the diner's door jangled loudly, shattering the quiet. 3 men strode in, their laughter loud and abrasive as they pushed past the door. The leader, a wiry figure with a sharp jawline and an overconfident smirk, scanned the room like he owned it. His leather jacket bore a crude patch that read Blackthorn Riders, a name Jack hadn't seen before but could guess enough about. The other 2 men followed closely, their builds contrasting, one stocky and broad, the other wiry and twitchy, like a coil wound too tightly. They moved with a swagger that demanded attention, and from the way the locals averted their eyes, it was clear this wasn't their first disruptive entrance. Jack's gaze flicked to Marla, who had frozen mid-step with the coffee pot still in her hand. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously between Jack and the newcomers. The leader, who Jack overheard being called Dale by one of his companions, let his gaze settle on Jack's table. His smirk widened, and he elbowed the stocky man next to him, whispering something that drew a snicker. Jack felt their stares but didn't acknowledge them. He kept his eyes on his coffee, lifting the cup to his lips with deliberate calm. Years of training had taught him not to give bullies the satisfaction of a reaction. "Look at this guy," Dale said loudly, his voice cutting through the diner like a knife. "Big man, huh? Looks like he could eat this place out of business." The stocky man laughed, a low, guttural sound, while the wiry one leaned against the counter and smirked. Marla hesitated, then hurried back to the kitchen, muttering something about grabbing more napkins. Dale strutted toward Jack's booth, the soles of his boots clicking against the tile floor. He stopped just short of Jack's table, planting himself squarely in his line of sight. "You lost, big guy?" Dale asked, crossing his arms. "Don't think I've seen you around here before." Jack didn't look up immediately. He finished his sip of coffee, set the cup down, and slowly raised his eyes to meet Dale's. His expression was calm, unreadable, but there was a weight in his gaze that made Dale falter for half a second before recovering. "Just passing through," Jack said evenly, his deep voice steady. Dale chuckled, glancing back at his companions. "Passing through? Funny, looks like you're settling in. That your truck outside?" "It is," Jack replied, his tone still calm. "Nice ride," Dale said, though his tone dripped with sarcasm. "Bet it's seen better days. Kinda like you, huh?" The stocky man guffawed, slapping the wiry one on the shoulder. "He's got jokes today." Jack kept his composure, but his hand tightened slightly around the coffee cup. He knew exactly what Dale was doing, poking, prodding, trying to elicit a reaction. "I'm just here to eat," Jack said, his voice firm but calm. "If you got something to say, say it. Otherwise, let me enjoy my meal." The laughter from Dale's crew faded, replaced by a tense silence. Dale leaned in slightly, his smirk faltering as he realized Jack wasn't intimidated. "You've got a smart mouth, don't you?" Dale said, his voice dropping an octave. Jack didn't respond, holding Dale's gaze with unwavering calm. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The older men at the counter had stopped their conversation, their eyes fixed on their coffee cups. The young mother near the jukebox quietly ushered her toddler away, her face tight with worry. "Come on, Dale," the wiry man finally said, his voice quieter now. "Let's get out of here. This place is a dump anyway." Dale straightened, his smirk returning as if he decided to pretend he hadn't been fazed. "Yeah," he said, turning toward the door. "Let's leave the big guy to his feast. Don't want him getting cranky, right?" His companions laughed nervously as they followed him out, the bell above the door jingling one last time. The diner fell silent for a moment before the hum of conversation slowly resumed. Jack exhaled quietly, his grip on the coffee cup relaxing. Marla emerged from the kitchen, her face pale but relieved. She hesitated before approaching Jack's table. "You okay?" she asked softly. "I'm fine," Jack said, giving her a small nod. "Thanks." "They're trouble," Marla added, glancing nervously toward the door. "Been stirring things up around here for a while now." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he set his coffee cup down and met her gaze. "Do they bother people often?" Marla hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Most folks just try to avoid them, but they've been getting bolder lately." Jack nodded slowly, filing the information away. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he also wasn't the type to ignore it when it came looking for him. As he paid his bill and stepped out into the fading afternoon light, Jack glanced down the street. Dale and his crew were nowhere to be seen, but Jack had a feeling this wouldn't be the last he'd hear from them. He adjusted his Marine Corps cap and climbed into his truck, the engine rumbling to life. As he drove away, the words Marla had said echoed in his mind. Getting bolder. Jack didn't know exactly what kind of trouble Dale and his gang were planning, but he had a feeling he was about to find out. The sun dipped low over Harmony Ridge, casting long shadows across the town as Jack Turner parked his truck outside the diner. Evening had settled in, and the familiar glow of the neon open sign flickered faintly against the encroaching darkness. It had been a long day at the community center, but Jack had found a rhythm in teaching his fitness classes. The work grounded him, gave him a sense of purpose. He stepped into the diner, the bell above the door chiming softly. The place was quieter than usual, with only a handful of patrons scattered across the booths and counter stools. Marla greeted him with a small, weary smile from behind the counter. "Back again," she said, grabbing a mug for his coffee. "Figured I'd end the day here," Jack replied, sliding into his usual booth. The quiet hum of the diner was comforting, and for a brief moment, Jack allowed himself to relax. But the peace didn't last long. The roar of motorcycle engines shattered the calm, the sound growing louder as it echoed down the street. Jack's jaw tightened, his gaze drifting toward the window just as three familiar figures dismounted their bikes. Dale, the wiry leader of the Blackthorn Riders, strode toward the diner with his usual cocky swagger. Behind him, his stocky companion, Sam, and the wiry one, Eli, trailed closely, their expressions twisted into mocking grins. Jack didn't flinch as the bell above the door jingled again, announcing their arrival. The atmosphere in the diner shifted immediately. Conversations halted, and the tension in the air became palpable. Dale scanned the room with a smirk before his eyes landed on Jack. "Well, well," he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If it isn't the big guy again. Fancy running into you here." Jack said nothing, keeping his gaze on his coffee as he lifted the mug to his lips. Undeterred by the lack of response, Dale sauntered over to Jack's booth and leaned casually against the edge of the table. "You know," he said, his voice dripping with mockery, "it's rude not to say hi when someone's talking to you." Jack set his mug down slowly, his calm demeanor unshaken. He glanced up at Dale, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze. "Hi." Sam and Eli burst into laughter at the deadpan response, but Dale's smirk faltered. He straightened, narrowing his eyes. "You've got a real attitude, don't you?" Dale said, his voice hardening. Jack didn't reply, his silence a quiet challenge. The tension in the room was suffocating now. Marla lingered behind the counter, her hand hovering near the phone. The other patrons exchanged nervous glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "You know," Dale continued, his tone turning menacing, "Harmony Ridge is a small town. People around here like to keep things orderly. Outsiders like you," he gestured at Jack, "tend to disrupt the peace." Jack leaned back in his seat, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. "I'm just here to eat," he said evenly. Dale's smirk returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Eat, huh? Funny, you don't look like you're starving." He jabbed a finger at Jack's chest. "Maybe you ought to think twice before getting too comfortable here." Sam and Eli snickered behind him, their laughter grating against the silence. Jack's patience was wearing thin, but he knew better than to rise to their bait. Instead, he reached for his coffee mug again, taking another deliberate sip. "Is that all?" Jack asked, his voice calm but firm. Dale's smirk twisted into a sneer. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice, so only Jack could hear. "This is my town, big guy. You do well to remember that." Jack set the mug down and slowly stood, his full height towering over Dale. The movement was deliberate, measured, a subtle reminder that while Jack had been calm, he wasn't someone to be underestimated. For a moment, the room held its breath. Dale took a small step back, clearly caught off guard by Jack's size and presence. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You think you're tough?" Dale said, his voice rising. "Let's see how tough you really are." Before Jack could respond, Dale shoved him hard in the chest. The force barely made Jack step back, but it was enough to spark a reaction from the diner's patrons. "Hey!" Marla shouted from behind the counter, her voice trembling. "Take it outside." Dale ignored her, his focus solely on Jack. Sam and Eli moved to flank him, their grins fading as they braced for a fight. Jack took a slow breath, his muscles coiled, but his demeanor steady. "You don't want to do this," he said quietly. Dale laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Oh, I think I do." The first punch came from Sam, who lunged at Jack with surprising speed. But Jack was faster. He sidestepped the blow effortlessly, his hand shooting out to grab Sam's wrist. With a quick twist, Jack forced Sam to stumble forward, slamming into the edge of a nearby table. Eli hesitated, glancing nervously at Dale before rushing in. He swung wide, aiming for Jack's ribs, but Jack ducked and countered with a sharp jab to Eli's shoulder. The wiry man yelped, stumbling back and clutching his arm. Dale growled in frustration, lunging at Jack with reckless abandon. He aimed a wild punch at Jack's jaw, but Jack blocked it with his forearm. With a swift movement, Jack grabbed Dale by the front of his jacket and shoved him back, sending him sprawling into a booth. The room fell silent again, the tension replaced by stunned disbelief. Dale struggled to his feet, his face red with humiliation. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice shaking with anger. Jack didn't move, his expression calm, but unyielding. "Walk away," he said firmly. Dale hesitated, his pride warring with his survival instincts. Finally, he motioned for Sam and Eli to follow him. The three men stumbled out of the diner there. Earlier bravado shattered. As the bell above the door jingled one last time, the room let out a collective sigh of relief. Marla approached Jack cautiously, her face pale but grateful. "You okay?" "I'm fine," Jack said, adjusting his Marine Corps cap. The older men at the counter nodded their approval, while the young mother near the jukebox whispered a quiet "thank you." Jack paid his bill and stepped out into the cool night air, his mind racing. He had no doubt this was far from over. Dale and his crew weren't the type to let something like this go. But Jack wasn't worried. He'd faced far worse in his life, and he wasn't about to back down now. As he climbed into his truck and drove off, Jack couldn't help but wonder what his next move should be. For now, he'd wait. But if Dale came looking for trouble again, Jack would be ready. The quiet of the night was deceptive. Harmony Ridge seemed peaceful under the pale glow of the streetlights, its narrow roads and small storefronts bathed in an eerie stillness. But for Jack Turner, the silence carried weight, a forewarning of what was to come. After the confrontation at the diner, Jack had driven home, his mind replaying the events in sharp detail. Dale and his crew had left humiliated, their parting threats hanging in the air like the acrid scent of smoke after a fire. "This isn't over," Dale had hissed before storming out, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Jack knew better than to dismiss those words. Men like Dale didn't take defeat lightly. They would return, bolder, angrier, and with backup. The next morning, Harmony Ridge awoke to a new kind of tension. Whispers followed Jack as he stepped into the general store to pick up a few essentials. Behind the counter, Mrs. Callahan, the elderly shopkeeper, avoided meeting his eyes. The other customers, scattered between aisles of canned goods and produce, barely acknowledged him, their conversations stopping abruptly whenever he drew near. Jack wasn't surprised. He had seen this before, fear spreading like a shadow, silencing those it touched. He suspected Dale's influence extended beyond the diner, and now that Jack had crossed him, the town's unease had only deepened. As Jack paid for his items, Mrs. Callahan spoke hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're brave," she said, her eyes darting toward the door, as if someone might overhear. "But I hope you know what you're doing." Jack looked at her, his expression calm but firm. "I'm just doing what's right." Mrs. Callahan's lips pressed into a thin line, and she handed him his change without another word. Later that day, Jack stopped by the community center, hoping the familiar routine of his fitness classes would offer some sense of normalcy. The gym was quiet when he arrived, the faint squeak of sneakers on the hardwood floor the only sound. A group of teenagers was gathered near the weight rack, their laughter subdued as Jack walked in. One of them, a lanky boy named Jordan, approached him cautiously. "Mr. Turner," Jordan said, his voice hesitant. "Is it true? What happened at the diner?" Jack regarded the boy for a moment before nodding. "I stood up to some troublemakers. That's all." Jordan's eyes widened. "You mean Dale and his crew?" At the mention of Dale's name, the other teenagers grew quiet, their expressions a mix of admiration and fear. "Yeah," Jack said simply. "You shouldn't mess with them," Jordan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Dale's family, they run this town." Jack's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Jordan hesitated, glancing nervously at his friends before speaking. Dale's dad owns a bunch of businesses around here. His uncle's on the town council. They can get away with anything. Everyone knows it. The pieces began to fall into place. Jack had suspected Dale's influence extended beyond his gang, but this confirmed it. Harmony Ridge wasn't just dealing with a group of thugs. It was dealing with a system of intimidation and control. Thanks for telling me, Jordan, Jack said, his tone steady. Jordan nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Be careful, Mr. Turner. They don't like it when people fight back. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack returned home, his thoughts heavy. He had seen men like Dale's family before. People who wielded power through fear, using their wealth and connections to keep others in line. It was a familiar story, one he'd encountered during his years in the Marines. And just like before, Jack knew that standing up to them wouldn't be easy. That night, as Jack sat in his modest living room, the first sign of trouble appeared. A pair of headlights flashed through his window, illuminating the walls with a harsh glare. Jack stood, his body tense, and moved to the window. Outside, a car idled at the edge of his driveway, its engine rumbling low and steady. Jack could make out the silhouettes of two figures inside, their faces obscured by the darkness. He stepped onto his porch, his imposing frame illuminated by the faint glow of the porch light. The car revved its engine once, then twice, before peeling away into the night. Jack watched it go, his jaw tightening. The message was clear. Dale and his crew were watching. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Strange cars drove by his house at odd hours, their occupants lingering just long enough to make their presence known. At the community center, Jack noticed unfamiliar faces hanging around the parking lot, their postures tense and their eyes darting toward him whenever he stepped outside. Even in town, Jack felt their presence. At the diner, at the general store, on the quiet streets of Harmony Ridge, Dale's crew made sure Jack knew they were never far away. But Jack refused to be intimidated. He went about his routine with the same quiet determination, his calm demeanor unshaken. If Dale thought he could scare Jack into backing down, he was sorely mistaken. One evening, Marla stopped Jack as he was leaving the diner. She glanced nervously around before speaking, her voice low. Be careful, she said. Dale's dad, Charles, he's not just rich. He's got the sheriff in his pocket. If they want to cause you trouble, they will. Jack nodded, his expression serious. Thanks for the warning. Marla hesitated, then added, I've seen people stand up to them before. It doesn't end well. I'm not most people, Jack replied, his tone firm. Marla sighed, a mix of frustration and admiration crossing her face. Just don't do anything reckless, okay? That night, Jack sat on his porch, the cool air brushing against his skin as he stared out at the quiet street. He thought about the town, about the people who lived in fear of Dale's family, and about the system that had allowed them to thrive. Jack had come to Harmony Ridge looking for peace, but now it was clear that peace would come at a cost. If he wanted to make a real difference, he couldn't just defend himself. He had to dismantle the power structure that kept Dale and his family in control. As the stars blinked overhead, Jack made a silent promise. He wasn't going anywhere, and he wasn't backing down. This fight was just beginning. The morning light filtered through the curtains of Jack Turner's modest living room, illuminating the sparse furnishings. Sitting at the small dining table, Jack sifted through notes he had jotted down over the past week. The scraps of conversations, observations, and whispered warnings painted a grim picture of Harmony Ridge. This wasn't just about Dale Donovan and his gang. It was about a deeply rooted culture of intimidation, one that thrived on silence and fear. If Jack was going to make any real change, he'd need more than his fists. He needed evidence. Jack's first stop was the general store, where Mrs. Callahan was busy stocking shelves. The elderly shopkeeper hesitated when Jack approached, her weathered hands pausing over a box of canned goods. Morning, Mrs. Callahan, Jack greeted, his voice calm but purposeful. Morning, she replied cautiously, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone to walk in. I was hoping you could tell me a bit about the Donovan family, Jack said, leaning slightly against the counter. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Why do you want to stir that pot? Because it needs stirring, Jack replied firmly. People are scared, and I want to understand. Why? Mrs. Callahan sighed, her shoulders slumping as she glanced around the store. Finally, she lowered her voice. Charles Donovan and his brother Frank have had this town in their grip for years. Charles owns property and loans money to struggling businesses, but it's not out of kindness. Miss a payment, and you'll find yourself out of business or worse. And Frank, Jack asked, he uses his position on the council to keep people in line. If you've got a problem with the Donovan family, don't bother calling the police. They won't help. Jack nodded, absorbing her words. What about Dale? Mrs. Callahan shook her head. He's the enforcer. Charles keeps his hands clean, but Dale makes sure no one steps out of line. Vandalism, threats, roughing people up, it all goes through him and his gang. Before Jack could ask more, the bell above the door jingled, and a customer walked in. Mrs. Callahan quickly straightened, her expression shifting to a polite but wary smile. Jack took the hint and left, but her words stayed with him. At the community center later that day, Jack spoke to a middle-aged man named Henry, who worked part-time maintaining the gym. Henry was a quiet, unassuming man with kind eyes, but his expression darkened when Jack mentioned the Donovan family. They drove my cousin out of town, Henry said bitterly, setting down a mop as he leaned against the wall. He opened a small auto repair shop last year. Business was good at first, but then Dale and his crew started hanging around. Customers stopped coming, and one night the place got trashed, windows smashed, tools stolen. My cousin reported it, but nothing happened. A week later, he packed up and left. Jack frowned. No one stood up for him. People were scared, Henry admitted. Still are. Dale's got his dad's money and his uncle's connections. Who's going to fight that? I will, Jack said simply, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Henry studied him for a moment, then nodded. If anyone can, it's you. As Jack continued piecing together the town's history, he noticed a recurring figure in the background of Dale's crew, Eli Myers. The wiry, nervous young man had been present during the diner altercation, but unlike Dale and Sam, Eli hadn't shown the same bravado. In fact, Jack remembered the hesitation in his movements, the uncertainty in his eyes. Jack decided to approach Eli directly. He found him at the local auto parts store, where Eli worked evenings stocking shelves. Jack parked his truck discreetly across the street and waited until Eli stepped outside, the faint glow of a cigarette illuminating his face. Eli, Jack called out as he crossed the street, his deep voice cutting through the quiet. Eli froze, his hand halfway to his pocket. What do you want? He asked warily, his eyes darting toward the store's entrance. To talk, Jack said, stopping a few feet away. He kept his tone calm but firm. I'm not here to fight you. Eli exhaled sharply, tossing his cigarette to the ground and grinding it under his heel. Look, I don't want any trouble. I'm not the one causing trouble, Jack replied. But I think you know who is. Eli's jaw tightened, and he glanced around nervously. You don't get it, man. Dale, he's got connections. If he finds out I'm talking to you, he won't, Jack assured him. But if you want out of this mess, you need to start being honest. Help me understand what's going on. For a moment, Eli said nothing, his shoulders tense as he wrestled with his decision. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine, but not here. They met later that night in Jack's truck, parked on a quiet back road just outside town. Eli fidgeted in the passenger seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Talk, Jack said, his tone firm but patient. Eli hesitated, then began to speak. Dale, he's always been like this. Ever since high school. Picking fights, bullying people, getting away with it because of his dad. Charles covers for him, pays off anyone who complains, and if that doesn't work, Frank handles it through the council. Dale does whatever he wants, and no one stops him. What about the gang? Jack asked. Most of them are just kids trying to look tough, Eli admitted. But Dale keeps a few loyal guys around, Sam mostly. He's the muscle. And me, he trailed off, his voice heavy with guilt. What about you? Jack pressed. Eli looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to join, but Dale made it clear I didn't have a choice. He said if I didn't go along with him, I'd regret it. And he wasn't wrong. Jack studied Eli's profile, noting the fear etched into his features. You don't have to stay in this, he said. But if you want out, you need to help me stop him. Eli turned to face him, his expression a mix of desperation and hope. What do you need? Everything, Jack said. Who he targets, what he does, where he operates. If we're going to take him down, we need proof. Eli nodded slowly. Okay, I'll tell you what I know. But if this goes wrong, it won't, Jack interrupted. I'll make sure of it. Over the next hour, Eli painted a detailed picture of Dale's operation. He revealed how Dale extorted local businesses, intimidated residents, and used vandalism to drive out anyone who challenged him. He also confirmed what Jack had suspected. Charles and Frank Donovan were the true architects of the system, using their wealth and influence to shield Dale from consequences. As Eli spoke, Jack's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about standing up to a gang. It was about dismantling an entire network of corruption that had held Harmony Ridge in its grip for too long. When the conversation ended, Jack dropped Eli off near his apartment, watching as the young man disappeared into the shadows. Driving home, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. The pieces were finally coming together, and he now had a reluctant but valuable ally in Eli. This fight was far from over, but for the first time, Jack felt like he had the upper hand. As he parked his truck and stepped inside, Jack knew one thing for certain. Dale Donovan and his family had ruled Harmony Ridge for long enough. It was time to take the fight to them. The early morning light filtered through the blinds in Jack Turner's living room as he spread a stack of documents across the coffee table. He had spent the better part of the night organizing his findings. Pages of notes from his conversations with locals, photos of vandalized properties, and the most critical piece, Eli's testimony. Eli's detailed account of Dale Donovan's reign of intimidation, coupled with the influence of his father Charles and Uncle Frank, painted a damning picture. But Jack knew that simply knowing the truth wasn't enough. To dismantle the Donovan family's grip on Harmony Ridge, he needed to shine a light on their corruption in a way they couldn't ignore. Jack's first stop was the Harmony Gazette, the small-town newspaper located on the corner of Main Street. The building was unassuming, with a faded sign hanging above the door and stacks of old newspapers cluttering the windowsill. Inside, the faint hum of a printing press accompanied the rhythmic click of computer keyboards. Eric Malone, the paper's lead journalist, was seated at a cluttered desk, a half-empty coffee cup balanced precariously on top of a stack of notebooks. Eric Malone? Jack asked, his deep voice cutting through the din. Eric looked up, startled. That's me. Who's asking? Jack Turner. I've got a story you'll want to hear. Eric leaned back in his chair, skepticism evident in his expression. I'm a busy man, Mr. Turner. What kind of story are we talking about? The kind that'll shake this town to its core, Jack replied, dropping a folder onto Eric's desk. Intrigued, Eric opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. The further he read, the more his expression shifted, from curiosity to disbelief, and finally, to anger. This is serious, Eric said, glancing up at Jack. If even half of this is true, it's all true, Jack interrupted. And I have a witness who can corroborate it. Eric closed the folder and leaned forward, his voice low. You know what you're up against, right? The Donovan family doesn't play fair. They've buried stories like this before. They haven't dealt with me, Jack said firmly. Will you run it? Eric hesitated, then nodded. I'll fact-check everything, but if it holds up, I'll publish it. This town deserves to know the truth. After leaving the Gazette, Jack headed to the police station to meet with Detective Noah Fletcher. The station was quiet. When Jack arrived, the smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. Fletcher was a grizzled man in his late 40s, with a weathered face that hinted at years of experience. Detective Fletcher? Jack asked, stepping into the detective's office. Fletcher looked up from his paperwork, his brow furrowing. Yeah, what can I do for you? Jack placed another folder on the desk, identical to the one he had given Eric. You can do your job. Fletcher raised an eyebrow, but opened the folder. His eyes scanned the documents, his expression hardening as he read. This is about the Donovan family, Fletcher said, his tone cautious. That's right, Jack replied. Everything you need is in there. Eli Myers is ready to testify. and I've compiled evidence linking Dale's actions to his father and uncle's influence. Fletcher leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Jack. You've got guts bringing this here. You know the Donovan family's got connections in this town. That's exactly why I'm here, Jack said. If you don't act, they'll keep doing what they've always done, ruin lives and get away with it. Fletcher sighed, rubbing his temple. You're asking me to take on the most powerful family in Harmony Ridge. If I push this, there's no going back. Good, Jack said, because it's time someone did. After a long pause, Fletcher nodded. Leave it with me. I'll see what I can do. 2 days later, the headline on the front page of the Harmony Gazette read, The Donovan Empire, Corruption and Fear in Harmony Ridge. Eric Malone's article was thorough and unflinching, detailing years of harassment, vandalism, and intimidation carried out by Dale Donovan and his gang. The piece also exposed the financial and political influence of Charles and Frank Donovan, including their history of silencing complaints through payoffs and backroom deals. The article included statements from anonymous locals, descriptions of vandalized properties, and even a photo of Dale spray painting a slur on a storefront, a photo Eli had secretly taken months ago. The town's reaction was immediate and explosive. At the diner, patrons whispered heatedly over their morning coffee, their voices tinged with both anger and disbelief. On the streets, groups of residents gathered to discuss the revelations, their faces a mix of outrage and determination. For the first time, the people of Harmony Ridge began to speak openly about their experiences. Business owners shared stories of threats and extortion. Families recounted sleepless nights after their homes were vandalized. And through it all, Jack saw a spark of something that had been missing for years: hope. The Donovan family, however, was quick to retaliate. Charles Donovan held a press conference the day after the article's release, standing on the steps of the town hall with his lawyer by his side. These accusations are baseless, Charles declared, his voice calm but laced with disdain. This so-called journalist and his sources are nothing more than disgruntled individuals with personal vendettas. My family has always acted in the best interests of Harmony Ridge. Jack watched the press conference from the community center, his jaw tightening as he listened to Charles twist the narrative. They're doubling down, Henry said, standing beside Jack. Let them, Jack replied. The truth is out now, and people are paying attention. Inspired by the article, more residents began to come forward, adding their voices to the growing chorus of dissent. One evening, the community center hosted a town hall meeting, where dozens of locals gathered to share their stories. An older woman named Margaret stood up, her voice trembling but resolute. When my son's shop was vandalized, we were too scared to say anything. But now I'm not afraid anymore. A young man followed, his voice steady. Dale and his crew came to my father's store demanding protection money. When we refused, they slashed our tires. I've been waiting years to tell someone. As the meeting continued, Jack felt a surge of pride. The town was beginning to stand together, their fear giving way to determination. Back at his house that night, Jack sat on the porch, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. The fight was far from over. Charles and Frank Donovan would do everything in their power to maintain their hold on Harmony Ridge. But for the first time, Jack felt like the tide was turning. The truth was out, and the town was no longer silent. As the stars blinked overhead, Jack made a silent vow. No matter what came next, he would see this fight through to the end. The bright afternoon sun bore down on Harmony Ridge's town square as Charles Donovan stood before a cluster of microphones, his tailored suit and polished demeanor exuding confidence. Flanked by his team of lawyers and flanked by Dale's uncle, Frank, Charles addressed the crowd of reporters gathered on the courthouse steps. These accusations, he began, his deep, measured voice carrying across the square, are nothing more than a baseless smear campaign orchestrated by individuals who do not understand the values of this community or the contributions my family has made to it. Jack Turner watched from the edge of the square, his arms crossed as he leaned against a lamppost. A small crowd of residents had gathered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to quiet skepticism. Charles's speech continued, his tone shifting from calm to pointed. The so-called evidence presented by Mr. Turner and this reporter is a collection of half-truths and outright fabrications. My family has always acted in the best interests of Harmony Ridge, and we will not be bullied by outsiders with an agenda. Jack's jaw tightened as Charles's gaze swept over the crowd, his practiced charisma weaving a narrative that cast himself as the victim. Frank Donovan, standing silently to Charles's right, offered an occasional nod of agreement, his presence a subtle reminder of the family's influence over the town council. As the press conference ended, the crowd began to disperse, their murmurs filling the air. Some residents appeared convinced by Charles's words, their loyalty to the Donovan family unshaken. Others, however, exchanged uneasy glances, their trust in the family clearly eroding. Jack lingered, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. He spotted Eric Malone, the journalist, scribbling furiously in his notebook before making his way over. "Thoughts?" Jack asked as Eric approached. "He's good," Eric admitted reluctantly. Twisted the story into his favor without even breaking a sweat. "But the cracks are starting to show. People are questioning him." "Not enough," Jack said grimly. Eric adjusted his glasses, a determined look on his face. "We'll keep pushing. The truth is out there. It's just a matter of time before it sticks." That evening, the first sign of retaliation appeared. Jack returned home to find his mailbox smashed, its splintered remains scattered across the driveway. The air was heavy with the acrid smell of spray paint, and scrawled across the front of his house in bold red letters were the words, "Leave or else." Jack stood silently for a moment, his gaze fixed on the vandalism. He wasn't surprised. This was exactly the kind of tactic Dale and his gang would employ. But if they thought this would intimidate him, they were mistaken. The next morning, the attacks escalated. As Jack drove into town, he noticed fresh graffiti on the community center, hateful slurs and threats smeared across the building's walls. A few of the teenagers Jack had mentored stood nearby, their expressions a mix of anger and fear. "Who did this?" Jack asked, his voice calm but firm. Jordan, the lanky teenager from his fitness class, stepped forward hesitantly. "Dale's guys," he said. "They were here last night. We saw them drive off." Jack placed a reassuring hand on Jordan's shoulder. "You did the right thing by staying safe. I'll handle this." As tensions in Harmony Ridge rose, Dale and his gang began targeting Jack directly. They followed him through town, their loud laughter and mocking jeers echoing in his ears. On one occasion, they cornered him in the parking lot of the general store, their aggressive posturing designed to provoke him. But Jack remained composed, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to their taunts. "You're not welcome here, Turner," Dale sneered, stepping closer. "Why don't you pack up and leave before things get worse?" Jack didn't flinch. "If you're trying to scare me, it's not working." Dale's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, motioning to his crew. "Let's go, boys. This isn't over." As they walked away, Jack turned to see Mrs. Callahan watching from the store window. Her face was pale, her expression filled with worry. Later that evening, Jack called a meeting at the community center. Word spread quickly, and by the time he arrived, the room was filled with residents. Some were familiar faces, business owners and neighbors who had quietly supported him. Others were new, drawn by a growing sense of solidarity. Jack stood at the front of the room, his towering presence commanding attention. He spoke plainly, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I know many of you are scared," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "For years, this town has been controlled by fear. Fear of the Donovan family and their power. But it doesn't have to be this way." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We've started something here. The truth is out, and people are paying attention. But we can't stop now. We need to stand together, not just against Dale and his gang, but against the system that's allowed them to thrive." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. One man, a middle-aged shopkeeper named Carl, stood up. "They've got money and connections," Carl said. "What do we have?" "Each other," Jack replied without hesitation. "Alone, they can pick us off one by one. But together, we're stronger than they'll ever be." The room fell silent as the weight of Jack's words settled over the group. Then, one by one, people began to nod, their expressions shifting from fear to determination. The meeting sparked a ripple effect throughout Harmony Ridge. Business owners began speaking openly about the threats they had endured, sharing their stories with Eric Malone for follow-up articles. Families who had been too scared to come forward now found the courage to stand alongside their neighbors. The town began to organize. Residents formed watch groups to patrol neighborhoods at night, ensuring that Dale's gang couldn't operate unchecked. Volunteers painted over graffiti and repaired the damage to the community center, their efforts a symbol of defiance. Jack worked tirelessly alongside them, his presence a steadying force. He listened to their concerns, offered solutions, and reminded them of their collective strength. Despite the growing resistance, the Donovan family didn't back down. Charles Donovan filed a lawsuit against Eric Malone and the Harmony Gazette, claiming defamation. Frank Donovan used his position on the town council to block funding for community initiatives, further dividing the town. But their efforts only fueled the town's resolve. When Charles announced another press conference to defend his family's reputation, the residents of Harmony Ridge staged a counter-protest outside the courthouse. Dozens of people gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Harmony Ridge and no more fear." Jack stood among them, his towering frame a symbol of their defiance. As Charles emerged from the courthouse, his gaze swept over the crowd, his expression hardening. "This isn't over," Charles muttered to Frank as they climbed into their car. "Neither is this fight," Jack said quietly, watching them drive away. That night, Jack returned home to find a small package on his porch. Inside was a hastily written note. "You're making a difference. Don't stop." Jack's lips pressed into a firm line as he folded the note and tucked it into his pocket. The battle for Harmony Ridge was far from over, but the tide was turning. For the first time in years, the people of Harmony Ridge were no longer living in fear. They had found their voice, and with Jack leading the charge, they were determined to reclaim their town. The air in Harmony Ridge felt heavier as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the small town in long, stretching shadows. Inside the police station, Detective Noah Fletcher reviewed the thick dossier on his desk one more time. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Testimonies, photographs, financial records, and a detailed account from Eli Myers. Fletcher sighed and glanced at Jack Turner, who sat across from him, his broad shoulders tense, but his face calm. "This is enough," Fletcher said finally, his gruff voice breaking the silence. "We got enough to move." Jack leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Then let's do it." Fletcher nodded, picking up the phone. "We've been building to this for years. It's time." The raid was planned with precision. Fletcher assembled his team in the station's briefing room, spreading a map of Harmony Ridge across the table. Dale Donovan and his crew have been using the old garage on Willow Lane as their base, Fletcher explained, pointing to the marked location. "It's where they plan their operations and stash their tools, spray paint, bats, and who knows what else. Tonight we're going in. No warning, no room for error." Jack stood silently at the back of the room, his presence a silent reminder of what was at stake. As the officers suited up and loaded into their vehicles, Jack followed Fletcher to an unmarked car. "I still think you should sit this one out," Fletcher said, glancing at him. "And miss this." Jack replied, his voice steady. "Not a chance." The garage loomed in the dim light, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust. Inside, the faint sound of laughter and muffled music spilled out, a jarring contrast to the tense silence outside. The police vehicles rolled up quietly, their headlights off. Officers moved into position, surrounding the building. Fletcher gave the signal, and one of the officers banged on the metal door. "Police! Open up!" The laughter inside cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of scuffling feet and frantic voices. A moment later, the door was kicked open, and the officers poured in. Inside, the scene erupted into chaos. Dale Donovan stood at the center of the room, his face a mask of shock and fury as officers stormed in. Sam, his closest ally, lunged forward but was quickly subdued, his arms pinned behind his back. "Don't you know who I am?" Dale shouted, as two officers grabbed him. "You're making a mistake. My dad will have your jobs for this." Jack stepped into the room, his towering frame casting a long shadow. Dale's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a flicker of fear behind the bravado. "You," Dale spat, his voice trembling with rage. "This is your doing." Jack said nothing, his calm gaze unyielding. As Dale was cuffed and led outside, he continued to hurl threats, his voice cracking. "You'll regret this. My family owns this town." News of the raid spread quickly. By the next morning, Dale and his crew were in custody, charged with multiple counts of vandalism, harassment, and assault. The arrest was a victory, but it was far from the end. At the Donovan estate, Charles Donovan paced his lavish study, his face red with fury. He slammed a newspaper onto his desk, the bold headline reading, "Donovan's son arrested in police raid." "This is outrageous," Charles barked into his phone. "I want every lawyer on this. Dale isn't spending a single night in jail. Do you hear me?" Frank Donovan sat nearby, his expression grim. "It's not just Dale, Charles. The town's turning. Against us. That article Malone ran, it's got people talking. They're not scared anymore." Charles glared at him. "Then we make them scared. We remind them who's in charge." Despite Charles's bluster, the tide in Harmony Ridge was shifting. The arrests emboldened the townspeople, many of whom had lived in fear of the Donovan family for years. At the community center, Jack organized a meeting for residents to share their stories. The room was packed, the air buzzing with nervous energy. A young woman named Rebecca stood up first, her voice trembling. "My parents moved here 5 years ago to open a bakery. Dale and his gang vandalized it twice in the first month. We tried to report it, but nothing ever came of it. We almost left, but we stayed because we had no choice." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement. An older man, Carl, followed. "They threatened my grandson when he refused to join their gang. I've kept quiet all this time, but no more. It's time we stand up." Jack listened intently, nodding as each person spoke. When the story slowed, he rose to address the room. "Dale and his crew are behind bars, but this fight isn't over," he said, his deep voice carrying across the room. "Charles and Frank Donovan built this system, and they're not going to let it crumble without a fight. But we've already proven we're stronger together. If we keep speaking out, they won't be able to ignore us." The crowd erupted into applause, their fear replaced by determination. Meanwhile, Eric Malone continued his investigation, digging deeper into the Donovan family's financial dealings. His latest article exposed a web of corruption, detailing how Charles had used shell companies to launder money and fund illegal activities. The article hit the front page, sparking outrage throughout the town. Local business owners who had once feared retaliation now began to come forward, sharing their own accounts of extortion and intimidation. The walls of the Donovan empire were beginning to crack. One evening, as Jack returned home, he noticed a car parked down the street. Its engine idled, and the headlights flickered briefly before the vehicle drove off. Jack knew what it meant, a message from the Donovan family. They weren't done with him. Undeterred, Jack called Fletcher. "They're watching me," he said. Fletcher's voice was steady. "We're watching them too. Stay vigilant, Jack. This is far from over." As the days passed, the momentum continued to build. The arrests of Dale and his gang were only the beginning. The people of Harmony Ridge, inspired by Jack's resilience, rallied together to take back their town. Charles Donovan may have vowed to fight back, but the truth was no longer confined to whispers. It was out in the open, and the people of Harmony Ridge were ready to see justice served. For the first time in years, the town felt united, no longer bound by fear, but driven by hope. Jack stood on his porch that night, looking out at the quiet street. The battle wasn't over, but he knew they were closer than ever to reclaiming Harmony Ridge. And he wasn't going to stop until the fight was won. The courthouse in Harmony Ridge buzzed with a mix of tension and anticipation. The Donovan trial had drawn widespread attention, with reporters, townspeople, and even outsiders filling the gallery. It wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. For years, the Donovan family had loomed over Harmony Ridge like a dark cloud, their influence smothering anyone who dared to challenge them. Now, the spotlight was firmly on them, and the town was ready to see justice served. Jack Turner stood outside the courthouse, his imposing frame silhouetted against the morning sun. As people filed in, they offered nods of encouragement or quiet words of gratitude. Jack acknowledged them with a steady gaze, his determination unshaken. Inside, the courtroom was packed. On one side sat Dale Donovan, flanked by his high-powered defense attorneys. Despite their polished appearance, there was a nervous energy about them, a crack in their usual confidence. Dale, dressed in a sharp suit, fidgeted uncomfortably in his chair. Across the aisle sat the prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Lauren Monroe. Lauren was a formidable presence, a woman known for her tenacity and sharp intellect. She had worked tirelessly to prepare the case, and her confidence radiated as she rose. To deliver her opening statement, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Lauren began, her voice clear and steady. "This case is about more than one man's actions. It's about a pattern of intimidation, violence, and corruption that has plagued this town for years." She gestured toward Dale, her expression resolute. "Dale Donovan and his associates have terrorized this community, targeting individuals and businesses with impunity. But their actions didn't stop there. Behind them stood a system, a network of power and influence that shielded them from accountability. Today, we will lay bare the truth." The defense countered with a carefully crafted argument, painting Dale as a misunderstood young man and dismissing the charges as exaggerated or baseless. Charles Donovan had spared no expense in assembling a legal team skilled at sowing doubt. But Lauren was prepared. The first major witness called to the stand was Eli Myers. As he walked to the witness box, the room fell silent. Eli's nervousness was evident in his shaky hands and the way his eyes darted around the courtroom. But when he sat down and locked eyes with Jack in the gallery, a sense of resolve seemed to settle over him. Lauren approached him with a supportive smile. "Mr. Myers, can you describe your relationship with Dale Donovan?" Eli took a deep breath. "I was part of his crew," he admitted, his voice trembling. "At first, I didn't want to be. But Dale, he doesn't take no for an answer. He threatened me, said if I didn't join, I'd regret it." "And what did being part of his crew entail?" Lauren pressed. Eli hesitated, then began to detail the gang's activities: vandalism, harassment, extortion. He described how Dale would target businesses that didn't comply with his demands and how the crew used fear to maintain control. "Why did you stay?" Lauren asked gently. "I was scared," Eli said, his voice cracking. "Scared of Dale, scared of his dad. Everyone knows the Donovan family runs this town. I thought if I kept my head down, I'd be safe." The defense attempted to discredit Eli, accusing him of lying to save himself. But Lauren skillfully redirected, pointing out the courage it took for Eli to come forward and the consistency of his testimony with other evidence. When Jack was called to the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. His towering presence and calm demeanor commanded attention as he raised his hand and took the oath. "Mr. Turner," Lauren began, "can you explain how you became involved in this case?" Jack recounted his initial confrontation with Dale and his gang at the diner, detailing the events that followed without embellishment. His deep voice carried across the room, each word measured and deliberate. "Why didn't you back down?" Lauren asked. Jack's gaze swept over the courtroom, pausing briefly on Dale before settling on Valerie. "Because I've seen what happens when bullies go unchecked," he said. "People like Dale thrive on fear, and I wasn't going to let him intimidate me, or anyone else, into silence." Lauren nodded. "What did you do to help the investigation?" "I gathered evidence," Jack replied. "I spoke to people who had been targeted, listened to their stories, and encouraged them to come forward. And I worked with Eli to expose the full extent of Dale's operation." The defense's cross-examination attempted to paint Jack as an outsider stirring up trouble, but Jack remained unshaken. His responses were calm, his resolve unbreakable. The prosecution presented a damning array of evidence. Photos of vandalized properties, financial records showing payments funneled through shell companies, and video footage of Dale and his crew in action left little room for doubt. One particularly compelling piece of evidence was a recording of Eli's confession, which had been corroborated by other witnesses. As the evidence piled up, Dale's confidence visibly eroded. His smirk disappeared, replaced by a clenched jaw and darting eyes. In her closing argument, Lauren spoke directly to the jury. This case isn't just about holding Dale Donovan accountable for his crimes, she said. It's about sending a message to him, to his family, and to this town that no one is above the law. The people of Harmony Ridge deserve to live without fear, and you have the power to make that happen. The defense attempted to sow doubt one last time, but their arguments felt hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson read the verdict. On the charge of harassment, we find the defendant, Dale Donovan, guilty. On the charge of vandalism, we find the defendant, Dale Donovan, guilty. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant, Dale Donovan, guilty. The murmurs that rippled through the courtroom were quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Dale slumped in his chair, his bravado completely shattered. His father, Charles, sat stone-faced in the gallery, his jaw tight as he absorbed the weight of the verdict. The judge's sentencing was swift and uncompromising. Dale Donovan was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 8. This court will not tolerate the abuse of power and the harm you have caused to this community, the judge said sternly. As Dale was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he avoided making eye contact with anyone. The trial didn't just end with Dale's conviction. Investigations into Charles and Frank Donovan were launched, their financial dealings and political influence now under intense scrutiny. The once untouchable family found themselves facing a wave of legal challenges, their empire crumbling under the weight of public outrage. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, their cheers erupting as news of the verdict spread. Jack stepped outside to find himself surrounded by grateful townspeople. "You did it," Rebecca said, her eyes shining with emotion. "We all did," Jack replied, his deep voice filled with quiet pride. For the first time in years, Harmony Ridge felt like a town free of fear. As Jack walked away from the courthouse, he knew the fight wasn't entirely over. There was still work to be done. But the people of Harmony Ridge had found their voice, and with it, their strength. And Jack Turner would always be there to stand with them. The courthouse steps were quiet now, the crowd having dispersed hours earlier. Jack Turner lingered for a moment, his gaze sweeping over Harmony Ridge as the last rays of sunlight bathed the town in a warm, golden glow. The sense of tension that had gripped the streets for years was finally easing, replaced by an atmosphere of cautious hope. For Jack, the journey to this moment had been long and grueling. As he stood there, his thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the events that had brought him to this point. Not just his personal battles, but the fight to help this town reclaim its dignity. Harmony Ridge had always been a place with potential. Its tree-lined streets, once marked by a stifling silence, now hummed with renewed energy. Local businesses, many of which had suffered under the Donovan family's oppressive shadow, were beginning to thrive again. The diner where it had all started was bustling, the neon sign outside now glowing steadily. Inside, the mood was lighter, with laughter and conversation filling the air. Even the community center, once a target of Dale's gang, had become a hub of activity. Jack was there often, helping repaint the walls, repair broken fixtures, and organize new programs. He found satisfaction in the work, not just because it helped rebuild the town physically, but because it brought people together. Jordan, the teenager from Jack's fitness class, had stepped up as a leader among the younger crowd. He and his friends had started a volunteer group, offering to clean up vandalized properties and assist elderly residents with small repairs. "It's crazy how much has changed," Jordan said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow after finishing a mural on the community center's exterior. "I never thought we'd get here." Jack smiled, his deep voice steady. "Change starts with people willing to fight for it. You and your friends are proof of that." Late one evening, Jack sat on the porch of his modest home, the cool night air brushing against his skin. He sipped his coffee, staring at the stars scattered across the dark sky. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. He thought about his arrival in Harmony Ridge, a town that had seemed like just another stop on his journey. But it had become so much more, a place where he had confronted not just external challenges, but his own fears and doubts. For years, Jack had sought a sense of purpose, something to anchor him after his service in the Marines. He had found it here, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, steady work of helping others. The town's transformation mirrored his own. Both had been battered, scarred by fear and division, but both had emerged stronger. Jack had always believed in resilience, a quality instilled in him during his time in the military. But Harmony Ridge taught him something deeper, the power of community. It wasn't just his strength or determination that had turned the tide. It was the courage of people like Eli Myers, who overcame fear to speak the truth, like Rebecca, who refused to let the past define her family's future, and like Jordan, who stepped up to inspire the next generation. Jack understood now that change wasn't something one person could force. It was a collective effort, a series of small but meaningful acts that, together, created something powerful. He also saw the importance of holding systems accountable. The Donovan family's downfall was a reminder that unchecked power could corrupt even the most idyllic of places. But it was also a testament to what could happen when people stood together and refused to be silenced. Despite the progress, Jack knew the journey wasn't over. The Donovan family's influence had been weakened, but Charles and Frank still had resources and allies. Legal battles loomed, and the town's path to recovery would be neither quick nor easy. Jack also recognized the scars left by years of oppression. Some residents still hesitated to speak out, their fear not entirely erased. And while the younger generation embraced change, older residents struggled to let go of the past. But Jack didn't see these challenges as insurmountable. If anything, they were an opportunity, a chance to keep building on the foundation they had laid. As the weeks turned into months, Jack found himself more deeply embedded in the fabric of Harmony Ridge. He had become a mentor, a leader, and, to many, a symbol of resilience. One evening, Rebecca approached him at the community center, her face bright with excitement. "I've been talking to some of the other shop owners," she said. "We're organizing a town festival, something to celebrate how far we've come. We'd love for you to be a part of it." Jack's lips curved into a rare smile. "I'd be honored." The festival became a turning point, a day of joy and unity that marked a new chapter for Harmony Ridge. The streets were filled with music, food, and laughter, and the sense of fear that had once defined the town seemed like a distant memory. As Jack walked through the festival, greeting neighbors and friends, he couldn't help but think about the broader implications of what had happened in Harmony Ridge. The story wasn't just about one town or one family. It was a reflection of struggles happening in communities everywhere, battles against corruption, inequality, and fear. Jack hoped that Harmony Ridge's journey could serve as an example, showing others that change was possible. It wasn't easy, and it required sacrifice, but it was worth it. That night, as the festival wound down and the streets grew quiet, Jack returned to his porch. He leaned back in his chair, watching the lights from the community center flicker in the distance. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged, not as an outsider, but as a part of something greater. Harmony Ridge had found its voice, and so had Jack. The fight wasn't over, but they had proven that together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. And for Jack Turner, that was enough. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heartfelt story. We wish you a joyful and warm Christmas filled with love and happiness. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join us for more inspiring stories to come. See you in the next one.